Morning, Amy.
Morning.
Good
We are
morning.
jumping in this morning on the seller's purchase of replacement property. Last week, we finished up with the RLAS and then covered the COP. So we had the residential lease after sale for the seller in possession 30 days or more. We finished that one up last week. And then we also covered that contingency for the sale of the buyer's property when your buyer needs to sell a property in order to complete the purchase moving forward. And then this form is the seller's purchase of replacement property. So this would be the seller's willing to sell this house contingent on them finding a suitable replacement property is how we would utilize this form. Please keep in mind that anytime you've got a contingency for either the purchase of the property or the sale of a property, we need to make sure to include that into our contingencies on the purchase agreement. So if I've got a seller that needs to find a replacement property in order to feel comfortable selling their property, because they don't want to be homeless, then I always go in and fill out this form in advance of getting an offer in hand, and I upload it with my seller disclosures. I use Homelight Listing Management for that. I upload it with those disclosures so that the buyer has access to the form in the way that I want it filled out when they go to submit an offer. So seller's purchase of replacement property, the SPRP is what we're going to cover first. And again, I have this one filled out. So if it's filled out in advance, it's an addendum to the purchase agreement, but we don't have the date yet. So I usually leave that blank. It'll get filled in by the buyer's agent when they go to write the offer. Address should go here. Again, buyer's names would be blank because we wouldn't have those yet unless you were doing it as a response to a counter offer and including this form. Then you would fill out all this information, then plug in the seller's names because you have that. All right, the seller's purchase of replacement property. 1A, finding replacement property. The agreement is contingent on the seller entering into contract to acquire replacement property or identifying suitable property to move to. Finding replacement property contingency. Seller shall within 17 days after acceptance remove the finding replacement property contingency or cancel the agreement. If seller does not remove the finding replacement property contingency in writing within that time, buyer, after first giving a notice to seller to perform, car form NSP, may cancel the agreement in writing, right? So this gives the buyer an out. So the buyer's agreeing, hey, we're in contract. I'm agreeing that you have 17 days to enter into contract, or you might change this. Maybe they need 14 or maybe they need 21, right? You can change that. We're agreeing to that time period. The buyer can't cancel because the seller hasn't found the replacement property yet. Okay. They can't cancel until we hit that 21-day mark or until we hit that 19-day mark where they can serve that 2-day notice to perform to the seller to remove the contingency, and then the buyers could cancel. So this top portion is kind of important, and it's identifying that we've got to find replacement property. Okay, so that's one portion of this contingency, is that we have to find a replacement property.
Question. If you already have a replacement property, is this something that you would fill out as well, just in case you somehow fell out of contract on the one that you were currently, or the one that you have found?
Absolutely. So that would take us to 1B, which is the or. So A is finding replacement property, and B would be or seller has entered into contract to acquire replacement property. So if they're already in contract, we check this box here that they've entered into contract, and we would put who the escrow holder is, right? It could be Placer, it could be ORTC, it could be Fidelity. Whoever the escrow holder is, you're going to put that information in there. Okay, so that's for one, it's just either A or B. You have to select one or the other. Either we're looking for that or we found it. Anastasia has a question.
What's the max number of days you can put in there?
You can put as many as you would like, and that you can get the buyer to agree to. You could put, we want 365 days to get in the contract. If you're a buyer's agent, you're probably not going to agree to that. But, you know, it's whatever you can get the buyer to agree to.
Okay. Thank you.
Depends how desirable the property is that you're selling, I guess. Okay. So 1A or B, you're going to either leave it as the default, which is they've got to find it still, or you're going to select B, that they've already entered into contract. And then C, if you check the box, this is also contingent on the close of replacement property. The agreement is contingent on the seller's ability to close escrow on the replacement property according to that contract. Because what happens if we enter into contract on a replacement property, we get 10 days into it and complete our inspections and the thing's riddled with termites and mold and our sellers no longer want to move forward with the purchase. If we don't check this box and they cancel the contract on that replacement property, then you are still in contract with the buyers. The buyers can still close on your property and the sellers still become homeless. So we want to make sure in most instances that we want to check this box here for the close of replacement property, that it's not only contingent on the sale, but it's contingent on the close. Okay. Any questions about section 1? All right. 2 is time periods, right? So this is going to relate to the residential purchase agreement that the buyer's submitting, that you're looking to get in the contract on. Time periods in the agreement for inspections, contingencies, covenants, close of escrow, and other obligations that commence from the date of acceptance shall begin on the day after seller delivers to buyer a written notice removing the finding replacement property contingency specified in paragraph 1A, or if we check this box, they're going to remain as specified in the agreement. If the close of escrow is identified as a specific date in the agreement, it shall remain on that date. So, right. So if we're not in contract yet and we have 1A, we probably want to leave it with 2A and the box unchecked, which defaults to, hey, the time periods for the close of escrow of the property the sellers are selling and all the inspections and all of those things don't start until the seller's delivered notice they've entered into contract on a property, a replacement property. If we've got 1B checked where they're already in contract on a property, then we definitely want to check this box here that's going to remain as specified in the agreement. Okay, that we're going to start everything right away. Okay, so the first one covers all of the time periods except for B, which is buyer's deposit. That's a separate one, just like it was for the contingency for the sale of the buyer's property. This one's a separate line item. Buyer's deposit shall be delivered to escrow within 3 business days after seller delivers to buyer a written notice removing the finding replacement property contingency as specified in paragraph 1A or as specified in the agreement. I'm probably always going to check this box here for as specified in the agreement. I want the buyer's deposit in escrow as soon as possible. Oftentimes I don't ask the buyer to go ahead and start inspections and loans and all of that until we enter into contract on a replacement property, because I don't want the buyer spending money on something that I may pull out from underneath them. The only time that there's sometimes that I've actually done that I've asked the buyer to start the time periods, except for the close of escrow. And then I made a statement that, hey, if we cancel escrow on you, the seller's willing to pay buyer X number of dollars towards buyer's inspection costs. Because now we've got those inspections on file. So if we pulled it out on the buyer, in a multiple offer situation when you've got like 10 or 15 offers, the buyer's really probably not going to care. You could start those kind of inspection contingencies immediately. But if it's just like a single buyer, they're not going to want to spend money for something that's not a solid deal. So then sometimes I put a caveat in there that, hey, if the sellers cancel escrow for any reason, the sellers are willing to credit buyer or pay buyer, up to $600 towards buyer's inspection costs or whatever, because we're going to get a copy of those. We can utilize them in the future. So, but I do make sure that they understand that it's the seller that cancels escrow is what makes that go into effect. Okay. So 2A is time periods for everything but the deposit. B is the time period for the deposit. So usually on 2A, I leave it open to after the day after seller delivers buyer written notice of the removal of the contingency, and buyer's deposit is going to be as immediately into escrow. C is the close of escrow. This is the parties agree that seller may extend close of escrow date for the sale of seller's property for a maximum of blank days or until blank date by providing buyer with a written notice at the time seller removes the finding replacement property contingency specified in paragraph 1A if applicable. So here, right, So my buyers submit an offer, or the buyers submit an offer for a 30-day close of escrow. And I kind of want their loan contingency and their appraisal and their inspections to go ahead and get done. It's a, you know, we want all that stuff moving forward. So we're going to check this box here on 2A, for they're going to remain as specified in the agreement, which everything's going to start immediately. We've got 30 days, even though we're asking for, you know, let's say we're asking for 14 days to enter into contract on a replacement property. Then down here, I might state that, hey, the parties agree that seller may extend the close of escrow up to 14 days, or maybe I put 15 additional days by providing buyer with a written notice at the time seller removes the finding replacement property contingency. And why would I do that? If our 30-day escrow already starts upon acceptance of the buyer's offer, and it takes us 13 days to find a replacement property for which our replacement property maybe is going to close in 30 days, we're already halfway through the contract. And so I want the ability to be able to extend this out to make both of our escrow periods match. Does that make sense to everybody why I might do that, or how you would use that extension? Yes, no,
Yes.
thumbs up, thumb down. Anastasia says yes. All right, I'm gonna assume because everybody else is muted still that you're all in agreement that you understand why you would do that.
Yes, understand.
Okay, fabulous. So you could use it that way. I always usually put a buffer zone in here, even if I leave this set for the default that the time periods are going to begin on the day that we provide escrow, because what if they negotiated, what if my buyers, or what if the sellers on the property my sellers are buying needed like a 45-day close of escrow, and now we don't want to make sure that my sellers aren't, you know, out. And so I'm always going to put some sort of buffer here that my sellers have the right to extend the escrow. Now, for the most part, you know, I would rather have the seller's property close as long as we know that the property the sellers are buying is kind of a done deal. So I may negotiate 15 additional days, but then I may come back to the buyer's agent and say, hey, everything's looking great on the seller's property. Instead of delaying the close of escrow, those 15 days that I asked for, what I would like is that let's go ahead and close as scheduled, but can the sellers have, you know, like a 14-day rent back? So you may negotiate it that way versus the extension of escrow, because having this property closed so you have the funds to close on the forward purchase could be beneficial. So there's lots of different angles you can work, but do note that this close of escrow, if you're going to extend it, it has to be requested at the time that the seller provides, removes this contingency. Okay, and then D would be other terms. So that's where you can fill in any sort of blank. So like if if we had asked for everything to start immediately, this might be where I'd be like, if seller cancels contract for any reason, then seller willing to reimburse buyer up to, you know, $800 for buyer's inspections. You know, you might put something like that there. If we were going to ask them to start immediately and we wanted to make sure that they felt comfortable that we weren't just going to cancel on them for any reason. Okay, you don't have to put that, but that would be an option. Even after the expiration of the time for finding replacement property contingency specified in paragraph 1A, seller retains the right to remove the finding replacement property contingency or cancel this agreement until buyer cancels pursuant to paragraph 1A. Once buyer receives seller's written removal of finding replacement property contingency, buyer may not cancel pursuant to 1A. Okay, right? Pursuant to 1A. So, right. So even after the expiration, seller reserves the right. So, right, this is the same thing as any other contingency removal that, hey, we asked for 14 days to enter into contract. We're now on day 17. Buyer hasn't served a notice to perform. Seller's removing the contingency in writing. Now we've removed the buyer's right to cancel based on that clause. Okay, any questions about the SPRP?
Only one page?
It's only one page. I know, it's like a miracle, right?
Yep.
I didn't know the car forms library even had documents that were 1 page anymore. All right. Then we are going to move on to the request for repairs. Here is our request for repairs. Please keep in mind, you can have multiple requests for repairs, so you always need to fill in a number up here. So this is a request for repair number 1. Date prepared, right? You're going to put a date in there, and then it's generally going to respond to the purchase agreement or reference the purchase agreement, and then you would put the date in the upper left-hand corner of the first page of the residential purchase agreement. Whatever that date is printed, make sure you've got the property address, the buyer's names, seller's names. This request for repair is generally provided by the buyer, just for clarification purposes, because it's a buyer request for repairs. So, right, buyer request, check all that apply. So you can have more than one option here. That's really important. Seller has no obligation to respond to buyer's requests. Okay, right? Seller doesn't have to respond. They can be like, we're not responding. I think it's rude as a listing agent to not respond to the buyer's request for repairs, to at least like deny it or whatnot. But the seller could. So the buyers could submit the repair request. The sellers could present the notice to buyer to perform to remove the investigation contingency. And because the time period's due, and they have no obligation to make any sort of response on the repair request, and they can just cancel on the buyers if the buyers decide that they're not going to move forward. Okay, so first, remember we can do multiple. So the first option here is A. So we would check this box here, buyer request that seller prior to the final verification of condition, repair or take other specified action for each item listed below or on the attached list. If we check this box, and then you would date the list and attach it. So this
Maybe I have a question.
Yeah.
Sorry. So if you're putting an offer on a house that's selling as is and you're doing inspections, is it better to ask for a credit, or if they're already saying they're not going to fix anything?
Yeah, so right, so number one, our residential purchase agreement always states that it's sale as is, but that the buyer has the right to ask for repairs. So even if in the counter offer, the seller countered us with the seller will do no repairs, I would much rather submit a repair request if it's going to cause my buyers to cancel, right? So if it's something that's like a deal breaker item that's going to cause my buyers to cancel, I would always rather submit a repair request than just send a cancellation. And you could do it. Chances are the seller is going to more likely agree to a credit, if anything, than actual repairs being done, because the sellers probably don't have any money to complete those repairs. So they're probably going to be more agreeable to a credit, which is we're going to get to on line C, but you could do it, ask it either way.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. So here we're going to put we want them to repair the cracked tile in entry. Okay, so we're asking the seller to repair the cracked tile in entry prior to the final verification of property condition, which the default on the RPA is 5 days prior to the close of escrow. So everything should be completed 5 days prior to the close of escrow. However, oftentimes I advise you guys to fill out 1 to 5 days for that final verification. They still should be having it completed 5 days prior to close of escrow. Okay, so that would be option 1, is we're asking for those repairs to actually be repaired prior to the close of escrow. And please keep in mind that these are not going to be lender required repairs unless it's a conventional loan, which I've seen more conventional appraisals lately come back with conditions on them, which I just think is crazy. But this would not be, we would not put lender required repairs in here. Okay, so 1 is the buyer would like these items taken care of. Now, if the buyer's asking for pest repairs to be completed and they want the full section, not just an itemized list, then that gets covered in section B. Okay, it's 1B is section 1, buyer requests that the seller pay to have section 1 work completed as specified in the attached pest control report dated, and you'd put the date of the pest report and then who it's prepared by, pest company, in there, and you would check the box for section 1 items. If you also want section 2 items, we could also check that box and we do the same thing. You'd put the date of the report and whoever completed the report here. Okay, and then the default on number 3 is buyer requests that either section 1 or section 2 work above sell. Oh, if buyer requests section 1 or section 2 work above, seller shall no later than 5 days prior to the close of escrow deliver to buyer a written pest control certification showing the corrected work has been completed, right? So this is saying that, hey, not only are we asking for the work to be done, but you actually have to have the pest company come back out and certify that the work was completed. Okay, that doesn't mean the pest company has to do the work. It just means we want it certified by the pest company that the work was completed. Keep
So
in
you
mind,
can have like, you can do some of the stuff, or you can have a handyman do some of the stuff, but they have to come out and re-verify that it's been completed.
absolutely.
Okay.
Yep. Keep in mind too, that in our request for repairs in our purchase agreement, it states that the seller, that any repairs requested and agreed to just have to be completed in a quality workmanship-like manner. So the seller can do those repairs, the seller can have a handyman do those, the seller can pay a licensed contractor. So if you want to specify, then you might want to add more clarity if you're asking for repairs to be done. So, you know, repair the cracked tile in entry by certified or by licensed flooring company, right? So you may want to clarify who you want doing the work if it's important to you. And then keep in mind too, that when we do our verification of property condition, when we have repairs completed, we want to verify that it was done in a quality workmanship-like manner, right? That it was done well. And if the seller did the repairs themselves, the buyers have the right to ask for any invoices or receipts from the work being done. So if it was done by a licensed flooring company, they have a right to get a copy of that invoice. Or if the seller completed the work themselves and they had to go, you could ask for receipts showing that the seller actually went and purchased the stuff and completed those repairs. Okay, so you do have the right to ask for those things. So 1A, 1B is passed. 1C is buyer request that seller credit buyer blank dollars at the close of escrow. So if we check this box here, maybe wanted a $2,500 credit at the close of escrow, we can check that box as well. Any credit included in this paragraph is separate from and shall not reduce or supersede any other credit in the agreement unless otherwise agreed. Credits need to be disclosed to buyer's lender, and total contractual credits may be limited pursuant to the agreement. Total credit amount may not be enough to remedy all defects and repairs. Okay, so it's got that little clause in here. So what we would want to do is, if we would negotiated a credit like this $2,500 credit, we would also want to include an AEA form, an amendment to the existing agreement, not an addendum, an amendment to the purchase contract, asking for a $2,500 closing cost credit. That's how it'd be listed on the credit. We would not say a repair credit, because then the lender's going to get all upset and angry, and it's going to probably prevent your whole thing from closing. So we want to ask for that as a closing cost credit. If there was already a credit negotiated, maybe at the purchase agreement, we negotiated a $5,000 credit. Now we're adding $2,500 to it. So on the AEA, we would state that the total credit to buyer at close of escrow to be $7,500, right? We want to just add clarity to that so that we can see that they get the full amount of both credits. Okay, the other option that we have is D, which is buyer request that seller modify the purchase price. The revised purchase price shall be, maybe we were in contract at 600,000 and maybe we're asking to reduce it to 590,000, right? So you've got 4 options there underneath section 1 of what the buyer can request. And the way that I have this form filled out now states that the buyer is asking for the cracked tile in the entry to be repaired, asking for both section 1 and section 2 of the pest to be completed. They're in addition asking for a $2,500 credit towards their closing costs, and they're asking for a reduction in the purchase price of $10,000, right? So we've got all 4 options checked, and that's what we're asking for, all 4 options. So if you wanted to clarify, like maybe instead of asking for a credit, We're going to uncheck that. And maybe they're not going to ask for the pest repairs to be done. So we're going to take that out. Neural. Okay, maybe they're just going to ask for a credit, and we're going to take out the purchase price reduction. And maybe they're asking for like a $10,000 credit, right? To cover the things, the cracks tile, the section 1 and 2 pest repairs. Maybe they're asking for a large credit. You could attach an addendum outlining what that credit is for, so it's not just like random stuff. So you might, let's see here. There is no agreement. But see, sometimes like on this section here, I would put C attached addendum, ADDENDUM number 1 for items buyer is requesting credit below. Right, so you might want to put something in there and then attach an addendum to this outlining why the buyer's asking for that credit, so that the seller has clarification on an official form. Completely appropriate. And we would use an addendum for that because we're clarifying, we're not changing an agreement. So that would be the correct use of an addendum. Okay. So that covers section 1. Is it better for your buyer to have a credit or reduce the purchase price? It depends on the buyer. For the most part, unless your buyer is a cash buyer, it's going to be better for them to get a closing cost credit. However, keep in mind that the credit's going to be limited to their total of their closing costs. So if we negotiate a $20,000 credit for repairs and their closing costs come out to $12,000, the seller's actually going to get to keep $8,000 of this $20,000 credit because the seller's credit can't exceed their closing costs. Okay, so kind of keep that in mind as well. So if we ran into a deal like that, then we may negotiate a $12,000 credit and an $8,000 purchase price reduction. Okay, so that we get the total of that $20,000. But for the most part, the credit's going to benefit your buyer more than a reduction because they're going to get that whole amount of the credit back, right, as a closing cost credit, which means the buyers save that money on their closing costs, which means that money's still in their account so that they can actually pay for the repairs after the close of escrow, versus on a credit, right, or a reduction in purchase price. If we reduce the purchase price from $600,000 to $592,000, and they're coming in with, only 3.5% down, even though we've reduced that purchase price, they're really only saving, let's go 3.5% times an $8,000 credit. They're only really getting they're only keeping $280 in their pocket. Okay, for the reduction in the purchase price. So in the long run, it doesn't benefit them as much, which is why, unless it's a cash deal, it makes more sense for the most part to ask for a credit. Any questions on section 1 of the repair request?
Amy, actually, I have a question. It's Claudia. So I've come across lenders that kind of they don't like when you start putting, like for instance, like you indicated the addendum, right? So, because they're like, oh, then they start asking questions or whatnot. So I guess what I'm trying to say is it kind of like a backwards way to do it, to address it here, but then not mention anything about an addendum and then create an addendum referencing this one? Does that make sense?
It's not going to matter. So where that's going to come into play is if there's already addendums in place to the purchase agreement. This would be, if we did an attached addendum with the list here, then it would be an addendum to the repair request. So on the addendum, it'd be addendum 1 to the request for repairs is what you would reference on there, just outlining what the buyer's asking for those. Like they would then itemize the items asked for repairs. The other way that you can get around that is you could put on the attached list dated, right? And then today's date, which would be 6/28/23. And then you could just do like a Google Doc with the list and, put the date on there and put that it's the list referenced in the buyer's request for repair. So that would be one way around it, because the lender's going to want any addendums that reference the purchase agreement. So if you reference the purchase agreement in there and we had addendum 1, if there's only one addendum and this is the first one, then the lender's not going to get it. But then if further down the road we needed an addendum for something else that the lender requested, and we added that addendum in there for clarification purposes, now we've got addendum 2 to the purchase agreement, then the lender's going to go, well, what happened to addendum 1? We need to see that, right? So that's why, so you could do attached list dated if you wanted to avoid the addendum, or you could do the addendum and just make it an addendum to the request for repairs instead of the purchase agreement. For the credit, we always want it to be on an AEA form, an amendment to the existing agreement. And we always want that AEA to reference the purchase agreement, not the repair request. Ultimately, we don't want anything that the lender is going to see to reference this repair request, because we never want the lender to actually have a copy of the repair request. Does that make sense to everybody? And
Yes.
okay, Claudia, did that answer your concern?
Yes, thank you.
All right. The other thing is too, is we're going to go down here to section 3 in a minute, which talks about lender required repairs. If there are lender required repairs, which usually get identified on an appraisal report, and that's how it usually gets flagged on the appraisal as subject to, then oftentimes I will fill out 2 repair requests if I'm asking for lender required repairs and additional repairs. And that way, and I make the lender required repairs repair request number 1, so that if the lender needs a copy of it showing that the sellers are going to complete it prior to the close of escrow, that's the only thing referenced on this repair request is the lender required repairs. And I always do it on repair request number 1, not on number 2. I would do the additional items that the buyer would like taken care of on 2, so that the lender, when they get a copy of it, it shows them that this is 1 and that's the only thing in existence. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yes.
I think you
ma'am.
lost me because you said to do it on a separate sheet so it doesn't have an addendum, and now you're saying to do request 2 with the list of the.
No. So what I was saying is, if the lender required repairs and we're trying to negotiate lender required repairs, which we'll cover here on section 3 in just a second,
Oh, got you.
then I would do that on repair request number 1 and I would just identify the lender required repairs on that repair request number 1. And I would do any additional items on a repair request number 2.
Got you.
All right. So section 1 is the types of requests. Again, there's 4 different types. We can request repairs completed, or we can request pest repairs, we can request a credit, or we can request a reduction in purchase price. And you can ask for a combination of any of those things, just 1 or all 4. Okay. Section 2 is your attached report. So anytime we're asking for repairs to be completed, we're going to reference the report in which those repairs are identified. So here it might be the home inspection. Oops, I can't spell, so we're just gonna go like, oh, that's still spelled inspection. All right. And you may identify the pest inspection, right? So whatever that is, and you can be vague here. You don't have to put who it's by, or you might put home inspection by home inspection company, if that's the name of the home inspection company, right? So you can identify which one it is, or maybe like the sellers had a home inspection done and your buyers chose to have their own home inspection done. You may want to clarify which one you're referencing. So you would include any attached reports that justify the amount that you're asking for up here, or the request that you're asking for in section 1. Section 3 is if you have a VA or FHA lender required repairs. So again, if I had lender required repairs and I was asking for additional stuff, I would probably take all the additional stuff off of this repair request number 1, and I would put it on repair request number 2. And then on repair request number 1, I would just leave the lender required repairs, and on attached reports, I may put appraisal. Because generally speaking, any lender required repairs are going to be identified on the appraisal report. So buyer's FHA or VA lender requires the following items to be repaired. Buyer requests that seller repair the following items, and seller or buyer shall pay for such repairs. So, right, so if we've negotiated with the seller that the seller is not going to do any repairs, and the lender comes back with lender required repairs, and your buyer still wants to purchase this property, we could ask for the seller to pay for those lender required repairs first. However, if they don't agree to it, then we can come back and say, well, my buyer still wants to buy it and the buyer's willing to pay for those repairs. So you would check that box indicating that the buyer is going to pay for them, but they need to be completed prior to the close of escrow. And here's where you would identify those repairs. Okay. So there's where you would identify that. If you don't check that box, the seller's going to pay for them. If you check the box, the buyer's going to pay for them. Okay, so that's A. B is the buyer request that seller pay for the following cost or expenses required by the FHA or VA lender. So if there was additional costs or expenses required, then you would fill that in there. And that
So right there, you could put the section 1 and section 2 pests, since that's what's required by FHA and VA, or especially VA, right?
Yeah, so VA, for the most part anymore, VA is not even requiring a clear pest inspection. They require Form 33. But yeah, here is where you would put section 1 or section 2 pest repairs, or all of them, clear pest inspection, here under the lender required repairs. Yes. So if the VA lender was requiring the pest repairs to be completed and pest clearance issued, instead of checking the boxes up here, we would want to write that in down here so that it's identified that this is a lender required repair. This isn't just something my buyer's making up and would like done. This is like the close of escrow depends on these repairs being completed.
And it would behoove them to do it because they're going to run into the same thing possibly with another lender, correct?
They could, or they could not. Yeah, it just kind of depends. They could decide that, oh, the FHA lender required repairs to be completed. They required the paint to be, the favorite one for FHA loans is if the house was built before 1978 and there's chipped or peeling paint. The appraiser is going to point that out, and the lender is going to require that paint gets scraped and repainted prior to the close of escrow. So if that came up and the seller's like, well, I don't want to repaint the whole exterior of the house, so no, we're not agreeing to that. We're just going to put it back on the market. They're just not going to accept another FHA offer. They would require conventional. So they could.
Got it. Thank you for the clarification.
Yep, absolutely. So 3A is what those repairs are. 3B is pay for the following costs required by the FHA or VA lender. So that might be like maybe the FHA or VA lender requires a engineering inspection to be completed. We're not actually asking for repairs. They're requiring an inspection. Or like I had a lender require a roof inspection at one point because there were stains on the ceiling or watermarks on the ceiling, even though they were in the bathroom and it was obvious they were caused by the person, leaving the doors closed with no fan on or window open during showers. But they required a roof inspection to be done. So I may put down here like roof inspection. SPECT, roof inspection. So maybe if the FHA or VA lender is requiring a roof inspection, we could stipulate that down here, that the seller pay for the costs or expenses. Okay. That's where that line would come into play. It took me a while to come up with an example for line 3B. Okay. Now 4 is talking about the investigation contingency. So if seller agrees to all of the buyer's requests or some of buyer's requests, and if buyer accepts seller's partial agreement below, buyer removes the investigation of property contingency, paragraph 3L3 and 8C, except the following, right? So this might be like, well, anyways, it removes, right? So it's stipulating that into the repair request that we no longer, this is the removal in writing of that contingency. We no longer have to submit a contingency removal form for that. If the seller agrees to it, then the buyer's willing to remove those contingencies is the default. The investigation of property contingency, paragraph 3L3, and that's referencing the residential purchase agreement. Okay. Or two is if we check this box, buyer removes those contingencies identified on the attached signed contingency removal form, CAR form CR. So keep in mind that if we do this second one, that we're removing the contingencies identified on the attached signed contingency removal form, it's still if the seller agrees to the buyer's requests, and if or some of them and buyer accepts that. We want to make sure on that contingency removal form that instead of referencing the purchase agreement, that we're referencing this repair request. Okay, so the contingency removal form at the top where it says, hey, this is in terms and conditions of the purchase agreement, you'd want to check the box and put buyer's request for repair number 1 on that contingency removal form. Okay, so if we're doing that. Buyer releases seller from any loss, liability, expense, claim, or cause of action regarding the disclosed condition of the property release, right? Okay, so does everybody, that makes sense to everybody? Section 4 about the contingency removals. It either defaults to an automatic removal if we all agree on the repairs, or we attach a CR form.
Yes, copy, clear.
All right. And, you know, the buyer's releasing seller from any loss, liability, expense, claim, or cause of action regarding the disclosed condition of the property, the release. So if we said, hey, we just want a $12,000 repair credit for the items identified, and then the buyer gets in there and starts doing work after the close of escrow and realizes there's more damage than they thought, that's on the buyer at that point. They should have requested, either done further inspection, they should have asked the seller to do the repair, so it could have been caught prior to the close of escrow, but after that, it all falls kind of on the buyer. Okay. Number 5 is the expiration. Buyer proposes this request for repairs, which shall be deemed revoked unless by 5 p.m. on the 3rd day after it is signed by the buyer. The proposed RR is signed by the seller and a copy of this RR is delivered to buyer. Okay, so the default is 5 p.m. on the 3rd day after signed by buyer, or you can change that date and time here on those additional lines. Or if buyer withdraws this request for repair anytime prior to the seller's acceptance by communicating withdrawal to seller or seller's agent. Keep in mind that you only have to communicate withdrawal verbally or via text message or electronically via email. There is a withdrawal of offer form that you may want to utilize after that just to confirm the withdrawal of the repair request. Okay, so that's 5, the expiration. 6 is the effect of buyer's request. Buyer makes this RR on the terms above and acknowledges receipt of a copy by making this RR any previous RR or seller response and buyer reply to repair request or seller response and buyer reply to request for repairs, CAR form RRRR can no longer be accepted. Okay, so keep that in mind. Buyer signs here. And then that's the end. So buyer's going to initial page 1, buyer signs page 2. And then we don't want to sign down here at the bottom. There's another buyer signature. Don't sign that before you submit it to the seller, because the seller has the option to respond. So here's the seller's response. Note to FHA, note to seller, FHA and VA. If parties do not reach an agreement on completing the repairs and other actions specified in paragraph 3A of the buyer FHA or VA section of buyer requests, buyer's FHA or VA lender will not loan buyer funds needed to purchase the property. If that happens, there is a finance contingency that has not been removed. Buyer may cancel this agreement. CAR form CC, right? So that just states that, hey, the buyer can cancel under the loan contingency. Buyer can also technically, if it's the conditions of the approval of the appraisal, which means that the appraisal states that the value is $600,000 subject to the following repairs, you could also cancel based on the appraisal contingency as well, because the appraised value is not there. Okay, so it's just stipulating that to the seller, like, hey, heads up, like if you don't approve this and they put something in there, then the buyer can cancel. Seller's agreement. A, the seller's response is going to be all. The seller agrees to all of buyer's requests. Okay. Or B is a partial. Seller agrees to all of buyer's requests except, so this is where you can put except, you know, seller doesn't agree to section 1C. That would be the credit, right? So, hey, we're willing to repair. Originally, I put like the tile in the entry and the section 1 and 2 of pest. And they're willing to agree to a $10,000 price reduction, but they're not agreeing to the $2,500 credit is what was there originally, right? So you would put in here what the seller does not agree to. Or additional conditions would be C, seller's agreement only applies. Oh, so we would do partial or all. And then additional conditions, seller agreement only applies if buyer removes those contingencies identified on the attached contingency removal form CR by signing and delivering it within the time specified in 1D below. So this might be like, hey, not only is the investigation contingency due, but your loan and your appraisal contingencies are also due. So we may want to do a more complete contingency removal form under the additional conditions. If we didn't check this box and we did a partial, and then the buyer accepts the seller's change to this repair request, then this up here is still in effect. So if we left this, the default, buyer removes the investigation of property contingency, it's already specified that that's going to get removed. So if we had this left as the default on 4A, and then the seller made a response, and then our buyer ends up accepting the seller's response, the buyer has removed that investigation contingency. Okay. But you could do additional ones by clicking this box here and then attaching a CR form, a contingency removal form. The expiration of the seller's partial or conditional agreement, if paragraph 1B or 1C is checked, right, then the seller's agreement to the repair request may be withdrawn by seller at any time prior to buyer's agreement in writing and shall be deemed revoked unless by 5 p.m. on the third day after it is signed by seller or by blank date on blank time, and it is re-signed by buyer below, and a copy of this RR is delivered to seller. So, right, so in order for it to not expire, buyer has to sign the third agreement and return it to the seller. That's the expiration. Okay, so we've got a seller agreement is A or B, so all or partial. You can attach additional conditions, so that could be an and then we have the expiration, which is and, or we've got these other options down here. So if we didn't want one, we could do 2, which is seller responds to buyer's request on the attached CAR form RRRR. Then we wouldn't put anything up here. We would just leave this portion blank, and we would check 2 that we're responding on the RRRR. Okay, or 3 would be where buyer's requests are not incorporated into the agreement. Seller responds to the buyer's request on the attached amendment to the existing agreement, CAR form AEA. No seller signature is required on this RR. Okay, so that would be like, hey, we're not willing to do all of these things listed up here, but we are willing to give you a $5,000 credit instead of a $2,500 credit. And we're going to attach this CAR form AEA for the change in terms. Or the seller does not agree to any of buyer's requests, would be 4. So you've got the option of 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, but not multiple. Okay, does everybody understand the seller's response section or have questions?
Technically, they don't have to respond though, right?
Technically, they don't have to respond. Again, I think it's really kind of poor form if you're a listing agent for them not to respond, even with saying, hey, we're not agreeing to any, but you don't have to.
I just typically let my buyers know, like, technically they don't have to respond, but just to kind of like give them that heads up.
Yep. Always a good thing to set those expectations that we can ask for repairs, but technically the contract says, you know, that it's going to sell as is, and the seller actually doesn't even have to respond to the request for repairs. So we may have to make a decision of what you want to do.
So even if you do respond and it's not going to be any repairs, you can just verbally tell them, because technically you don't have to respond instead of having to fill out this form and send it back.
You could. Yep. Absolutely. Seller responds to buyer's RR on the terms above and acknowledges receipts of a copy by making the seller response. Any previous RR or seller response and buyer reply to request for repairs, CAR form RRRR, can no longer be accepted. Okay. Keep in mind too that if your seller doesn't, as a listing agent, to protect yourself liability wise, I would check the box and have your seller sign it. because now the sellers have seen that the buyers made a request. You've advised your sellers that if we don't respond or we don't agree to any of the buyer's requests, the buyer may cancel the contract. We've advised them of that. They're stating what their response is and signing it so we can send it back instead of just doing a verbal. And then when the buyers cancel because they didn't comply with any of their repair requests, the sellers can't be, well, you didn't tell me they requested repairs, and they can't, like, right, there's a trail in writing that you did your due diligence as a listing agent. That's it's kind of like a CYA type thing, right? Like, cover yourself, to make sure there's that paper trail that, hey, I advised you, like, they made the request, you chose not to agree to any of the requests, we responded, they canceled. Like, protect yourself. It's an evil world out there. Okay, so there's the seller's response there. Again, we don't have to respond. And then if the seller responds on this form, then the buyer's going to need to respond as well. So if the sellers check B, then the buyers must come down here and fill out this bottom section. Buyer accepts seller's partial or conditional agreement, or buyers does not accept seller's partial agreement. Buyer withdraws request for repair number 1 and makes a new request on the attached request for repair number 2, right? So those are your two answers for the buyer. Either we accept it or we don't accept it and we submit a new request for repair. Okay, buyer's response.
Basically, it's like a counter offer.
Yeah, basically the sellers have made a counter offer to the buyer, like, hey, we've got a partial agreement. Here's what we're agreeing, or here's what we're not agreeing to. Is that acceptable? And then the buyer can say, yes, that's acceptable, or no, it's not acceptable, and here's a new one. Or they can just be like, no, it's not acceptable. Here's our cancellation. We don't want to move forward. Buyer responds to seller's partial agreement on the terms above and acknowledges receipt of a copy by making this buyer response. Any previous buyer response, seller reply, or seller partial agreement can no longer be accepted. Note to buyer, FHA, VA, if the parties do not reach an agreement on completing the repairs and other actions specified in paragraph 3A in the FHA or VA section of buyer request, and you've already removed or do remove your financing contingency, even though you may no longer be eligible for the FHA or VA loan specified in the agreement and may not be able to get another loan to purchase the property, you could be in breach of the agreement if you are otherwise unable to pay seller the purchase price. And then buyer signs. There is your RR form, your request for repairs. Any additional questions on the RR form? They've packed a lot of stuff into this form over the last couple of years. All right, we're going to move on to the RRRR form, which is the seller response and buyer reply to request for repairs number blank or other actions. So this, right, is a response to the buyer's request for repairs number 1. So that's what we would put here. If it was a seller response and buyer reply to the request for repair number 2, you would put that here, but we're not counting the seller responses. We're just counting which request for repair it was, which RR form we're responding to. You're going to put the date prepared here in accordance with the terms and conditions of the request for repair number 1, and then the date of whatever that request for repair was on the property known as the address between buyer and seller, buyer and seller referred to as parties. Seller response to buyer requests. The seller agrees to all of buyer's requests and request for repair number 1, right? So this would be the first option, except, and if that was the case, we could have just responded on the RR form because there's a line for that. So that's probably not why you're using this form. So you're probably saying, hey, at close of escrow, we are willing to do a $5,000 credit rather than all of those repairs you mentioned, right? So we're just going to check that box. To modify the purchase price, the revised purchase price shall be blank or other. So notice these don't say or, which means they're all ands. Okay, this is really important. If it doesn't have an or next to it, it's an and, which means that if I say, hey, I agree to all the buyer's requests for repairs in number 1, except purchase price reduction. Item 1D, I think, is the purchase price reduction. And we're willing to modify the purchase price to 595,000. Oops, 595,000. Remember, my original request was, I'm missing a zero, was we want the tiles repaired, we want the section 1 and section 2, we want a $2,500 credit, and we want a $10,000 price reduction. Well, now we're agreeing to all of those other items, except we're changing the purchase price reduction of $5,000 instead of $10,000, right? So these are ands. So if we say, right, so second we check this box here. So if we don't check this box and we just check this box here, we're saying that, hey, at the seller is instead of doing those repairs as specified, repairing the title, doing the section 1 and section 2, doing the reduction in purchase price and a $2,500 credit, we're willing to do a $10,000 credit and we're going to call it a day. This is the final answer. This is saying that, hey, we're not agreeing to the buyer's request. We're offering you a $10,000 credit in lieu of those repairs that you requested, basically. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? I've had lots of agents fill this out incorrectly, where they say, hey, we're agreeing to the things and offering a $10,000 credit, where in effect what they were really saying is, hey, we wanted to offer this credit instead of those items. So they've changed this a little bit over the years, so it's a little more clear, but that's, we want to make sure that we understand these are and items, not or items. Yes.
So if they have the other form, which form is this one? Can you scroll down?
Yeah, this is the RRRR, the seller's response and the buyer reply to request for repairs.
Got it. So if they have the other form filled out, and then this is their response. So this supersedes the other form because this is okay.
Yep, because you would say seller responds to buyer's request on the attached car form RRRR. Here on the request for repairs, and then you would come down to the RR and say, seller agrees at close of escrow to credit buyer $10,000. Okay, and then that's the final word, or modify a purchase price. But if I put a $10,000 here and then I say, hey, we're willing to modify the purchase price to $590,000, then we're saying, hey, we're willing to give you a $10,000 credit and reduce the purchase price. Okay. Any credit included in this paragraph is separate from and shall not reduce or supersede any other credit in the agreement unless otherwise agreed. Credits need to be disclosed to buyer's lender, and total contractual credits may be limited pursuant to the agreement. Total credit and price reduction amount may not be enough to remedy all defects or repairs. So keep in mind too that if we're doing a credit and or a reduction in price, we need to put that on an AEA form to the purchase agreement. We need to list it as a closing cost credit, and then you can just list the purchase price reduction on there as well. So an AEA, not an addendum, but an AEA form, an amendment to the existing agreement, because we're amending an existing agreement.
So if you fill this out the way this is, you still have to do the AEA.
Yes.
Got it.
Yes, because we still never want the lender to see anything that says repairs on it. Once a lender sees something with repairs, even if we're negotiating a credit, now they're going to want to see copies of the inspection reports and going to want everything cleared up and taken care of prior to the close of escrow instead of credits and reductions in purchase prices.
Well, it says repair at the top of this form. So how are you going to avoid that?
You're going to attach an AEA form.
Oh, just do the AEA instead?
No,
Gotcha.
You want to do both. You're going to do a response to the repair request, and you're also going to submit an AEA with these terms on there. You would do both. Okay. Note to seller, FHAVA, if the parties do not reach an agreement on completing the repairs or other actions as specified in 3A in the FHA or VA section of buyer request in the request for repairs, car form RR, buyer's FHA or VA lender will not loan buyer the funds needed to purchase the property. If that happens and there is a finance contingency that has not been removed, buyer may cancel this agreement, car form CC, cancellation of contract. Okay, so that's one. That's how the seller is choosing to respond to the buyer's request on the original repair request. 2 is seller's conditions. Seller's agreement only applies if buyer removes the investigation contingency, paragraphs 3L3 and 8C. This would be except for the following. So maybe they want to remove everything except for a portion of that investigation contingency. You could fill that out there. Or buyer removes those contingencies identified on the signed contingency removal form attached to the buyer's request for repairs, right? So if they attached one, we would check that box. Or buyer removes those contingencies identified on the attached contingency removal form by signing and delivering it within the time specified in paragraph 3A below. Buyer releases seller from any loss, liability, expense, claims, or clause of action regarding the disclosed condition of the property, the release. So our seller conditions is, hey, the default is this agreement applies if the buyer agrees to it, they're removing their investigation contingency. That's the default. As soon as buyer signs that they agree to this, that is removed. Second one is if the buyer had included a separate contingency removal up in their original request for repairs, we would say, hey, buyer removes those contingencies identified on that contingency removal that was already given to the sellers and signed. Or we're going to send a whole new one out is the third option, that the sellers are going to complete a contingency removal form for the contingencies they want the buyer to remove in order for this all to be valid. And then the buyers are going to sign that and return it. Okay. Expiration, seller proposes the seller response to buyer request for repairs, which shall be deemed revoked unless by 5 p.m. on the third day after it is signed by seller, a copy of this RRRR, and if applicable, seller's proposed CR in paragraph 2 above is or are both signed by buyer and delivered to seller. So that's the default. We can change that date time frame here with those blanks. If seller withdraws this request for repair anytime prior to the buyer's acceptance by communicating withdrawal to buyer or buyer's agent. Okay. The effects of the seller request, seller makes this RRRR on the terms above and acknowledges receipt of a copy by making this RRRR any previous RR or seller response and buyer reply to request for repairs can no longer be accepted. So there, and then the seller signs. Any questions about page 1 of the RRRR? Yes, Yolanda, there is so much information included in both of these forms. So it is being recorded and you can rewatch it at any time. All right. The second page of the RRRR is the buyer's response to the seller response or buyer reply to the seller response. And you're going to check 1. Note to buyer, right? We're just going to restate the same thing we've already stated like 4 times with the FHA and VA. So I'm not going to read that paragraph again. The default is the buyer accepts seller's response and agrees to seller's conditions, right? Whatever the seller put above, we're agreeing to it. The removal of contingencies and the repairs that the seller's agreeing to. Buyer accepts seller's response with the following modification. So maybe instead of a $10,000 credit, they wanted a $12,000 credit. So we would put that here. Provided seller agrees to buyer's modification, buyer and seller agrees to seller's conditions. This RRRR, including buyer modification, shall be deemed revoked unless by 5 p.m. on the third day after it is signed by buyer, or again, you can change the date and time, is the proposed RRRR is signed by seller and a copy is delivered to buyer or buyer's authorized agent. Or buyer withdraws request for repair number 1 and makes a new request on the attached request for repair. So it might be easier if they don't like the seller's response to just withdraw the response and submit a new one. Because now we're getting so confused. We have no idea what we're even agreeing to at this point, right? So we may just want to make a new one. Or we can modify it a little bit. We wouldn't want to like change it completely. If we change it completely, you submit a new one. And these are all ors. So it's either buyer accepts or buyer accepts with modification or buyer withdraws. It can't be and. So you can't check this one and this one. That wouldn't work. So it's an or. Buyer reply, buyer replies to the seller's RRRR on the terms above and acknowledges receipt of a copy by making this buyer reply. Any previous RRRR or RR can no longer be accepted. So buyer's going to sign here. So seller signs up here, submits it to the buyer. Buyer's going to choose their response, and then buyer's going to sign here. If the buyer chooses anything but 1 above, so if they check the box for 2, then, sorry, not anything. If the buyer checks the box for 2, Then the seller has to sign this form again. Okay. So if buyer chooses one that they accept and the buyer signs, we're done. If the buyer chooses 3 where they withdraw this request for repair and make a new one, then we're also done with this form. But if they check the box for 2 that we're going to modify it, then the seller either has to agree or not agree. Okay, so either the seller agrees to the buyer modification on the terms provided above. So yes, the seller agrees to a $12,000 credit instead of a $10,000 credit, or the seller does not agree to the modification and the buyer may submit a new request for repairs. Those are your 2 options there. You must check a box and then seller signs. Questions?
No,
Like
ma'am.
Yolanda said, I'm gonna have to go back and watch this over because there's so much. My husband's like, pay attention. I'm like, there's so much to pay attention to.
Right. And we just want to make sure that we don't have our seller sign here and here before we submit it to the buyer. So just one set of lines at a time, and then just take it one form at a time. Fabulous. All right. Well, that covers our SPRP, the seller's purchase of replacement property. It covers our repair request and our seller's response and buyer's reply to the repair request. So you have that all in your arsenal now. We'll get these recorded and get them published so you guys can rewatch these as necessary or as you desire. And just keep in mind that anytime we want to do a credit or a reduction in purchase price, we would do it on the repair request, as well as you also then want to submit an AEA form outlining those credits as the credits as a closing cost credit, and then just the price reduction. You wouldn't say price reduction for repairs. Don't say repairs on the AEA, because the AEA is going to be the thing that goes to the lender, not the RR or the RRRR. And then,
So if
Yep.
we just have like a basic credit for a roof repair, but we just want to say buyer to give seller, or seller to give buyer credit of 2,400, we don't have to specify what that's for.
you would just put for closing costs, towards buyer's closing costs.
Okay.
Make sure you log your attendance. It's in the chat box, the link to log your attendance. If there's any trainings you would like to see coming up in the future, please make sure to log them on that attendance form. There's a place for requested trainings. And I'm getting ready to put together our September, October, November calendar. Our trainings in December are probably going to be limited. And I'm looking we've got our training coming up at the end of what is this? June. So July. Keep in mind that we've got Scott coming back, who did our Chat GPT training. He'll be coming back towards mid to late July to cover keywords and SEO searches to help you appear better online. So he'll be covering all of that in July. And then we're working on booking a couple more trainings in August and September. I'm hoping to get one on YouTube videos and maybe one on a listing presentation. So those are kind of in the works, so stay tuned for those. See you all later. We'll see you on Tuesday.
All right. Thank
we won't
you.
see on Tuesday. No training on Tuesday because it's the 4th of July.
Oh, that's right.
But and then Jessica or Brick House will be back on Wednesday covering all things loan related. I don't know what the topic is on Wednesday.
Amy, I have a question about shoot, which one? Oh, the first form that we went over?
Yes, the SPRP.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah. So I did not do that for my people that are in contract right now.
That's okay, because they're going to close on their new home purchase.
Okay. I'm like, is it too late?
It's too late. It's too late.
Okay. Learn something new. That's all I could ask for. Learn something new every day.
Because that one was new construction. You're not necessarily worried about something coming up in the inspections or them canceling.
And I was gonna, when you were reviewing that earlier, or the first form that we went over, I was gonna ask if would we fill that out also for new builds, but I know technically I guess you would, but I wasn't sure.
Yeah, and the contingency, because you guys didn't even know. Because number one, we did it on new builds, it's usually on the builder's contract, and usually in the builder's contract, it would specify if it was contingent on the, oh, but this is for the purchase. So yeah, we could have included this, but because it was new build, the seller's not going to cancel on your buyers. So it wasn't like an issue of, well, what if they don't find something in the inspection reports they don't like, or what if, you know, it was kind of a done deal. So it wasn't done. It probably could have been.
That was gonna be my other question too, like, would this be something that the builders would have provided, but then this does say sellers purchase and
Yes.
replacement property, so, okay.
It's something we would have provided at the acceptance of the contract on the seller's property as part of that forms package. So it ultimately, you should always include it, and because they're purchasing new property, it wasn't like necessary per se, but it should probably always be included anytime your seller's purchasing forward, if they don't want to be homeless.
Okay, so like this, for this form to be filled out, I guess, in your forms, like in your home light listing management, included with everything else, so that the buyers are aware
Yes.
of it.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And keep in mind too, that when you check this box for close a replacement property, this means like, you know, anytime if they're not going to close on that purchase a replacement property, we can cancel on the buyers, like even up until like day 30 of the contract. If something blew up at the very end, we could cancel it and be done and keep our house. So just kind of keep that in mind. That's why I usually like.
So that is
check.
good to have, even though it is a new build, because anything could happen.
Even anything could happen. Yes.
Okay.
Nothing's going to happen. All right. But yes.
Thank you.
Yes. Any other questions before we wrap up for today?
No, ma'am, thank you.
All right. Have a fabulous day, and I will see you next week. Enjoy celebrating America's birthday.
You too. Thank you.
Thank
as well.
you. Bye.
Bye.